Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name's Jonathan Little. Hope you're having a great day. Today it looks like we're having a webinar. Also looks like we're giving away $500 in cash. Well, that's good. Head over to pokercoaching.com/TMC giveaway for your chance to win $500. Hope you're all having a great day. If you can hear me, if you can see me, please let me know. $500 for you all, huh? That's nice. All right. Today, we are going to be discussing turn strategy. I realize I'm a few minutes early. If you have any questions, feel free to fire them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. Make sure you get into the $500 giveaway at pokercoaching.com/TMC giveaway. That is the tournament masterclass. Also, the winner of this giveaway gets 6 months of poker coaching premium and access to my in-depth tournament masterclass. Hello from Alaska. I've never been to Alaska, but I hear it's a lot of fun there. Also hear it's cold. I like the cold weather though, so that's good. Eric says, you can see me. Good. Good. Oh, turn strategies. Did anyone get crushed on the turn today? Oh, man. I was on Poker After Dark yesterday. There was a hand where I flopped the nut flush draw against an overcard and a backdoor flush draw and a gut shot straight draw. I had ace jack of diamonds on 10-9-3. 10-9-3, 2 diamonds. I was pretty happy with that. I bet the flop, my opponent called. Turn was a jack. 10-9-3 jack. I had ace jack of diamonds. So I had top pair, nut flush draw. I bet he shoved me all in. I was kind of sick about it, but you can't really fold with all the draws available. And he had the queen 8 of clubs. Ooh, Dirty Bird got me with a gut shot straight draw. It's always nice when they give you just the absolute nut low turn. Sometimes they're gonna get you. But you can't be afraid. You can't be afraid. A lot of people get it in their minds they need to be a chicken. But don't be a chicken. You've been crushing it the past month. The longest downswing in your life. Wait, I'm not sure what you're saying. Is crushing it good or bad? Or are you crushing it or getting crushed? Who knows? Are my old videos on sit and go still relevant today? So look, you have to realize that pretty much all the small stakes games have become a little bit tougher over the last few years. The sit and go content you're referring to was made quite a while ago. That said, a lot of the principles still apply because of the small stakes games, even if they are playing kind of like the higher stakes games did back in the day, the games are still relatively soft, relatively beatable. I have to presume it's relatively relevant, assuming the stack sizes are still somewhat shallow. If the game is very different, though, if the structures are slow or if the stacks are deeper or something like that, then maybe not, because I know those sit and goes were relatively fast structured games back in the day. Also, they may have changed the payouts. I don't know. Assuming the structure is the same, though, then I think the answer is definitely yes. Louis said you had a 3-month downswing and you've been crushing it recently. Yeah, I mean, look, you have to be careful thinking in terms of time, right? Because 3 months could be either a lot of poker or not a lot of poker. For example, if you play live poker 1 time a week, 3 months is only, 12 sessions. And 12 sessions is basically nothing. But if you play 16 hours a day every day, 3 months is a lot. So you have to be careful thinking in terms of time and think more in terms of volume, right? All right. Let's get started. Today, we are going to be discussing turn strategy because this is a spot where a lot of people screw up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you part of my tournament masterclass that I released recently at pokercoaching.com. Again, if you have not gotten into the giveaway already, we're giving away $500 in cash. Check that out at pokercoaching.com/TMC giveaway. And we are going to go through and watch 2 parts of the turn section of my tournament masterclass. So let's take a look. We'll take a listen. This is going to be a little bit long, but we will get to it. We have finally made it to the turn. And in general, your turn strategy is not all that different than your strategy on the flop. You're still going to want to use your range analyzer to structure your hands to bet or check, except now you're generally going to be doing just a little bit less bluffing. Pay attention, by the way. Make sure you're paying attention because we're going to have a quiz after this. We're going to be having quizzes right after this section is over to make sure that you are fully understanding what's going on. So don't fall asleep. Wake up. Pay attention. We're trying to get good at poker here. Also, I appreciate all of you being here. If you like this, do me a favor, click like, click subscribe below. Let's get to it. On the turn compared to when you are on the flop. So on the flop, if you think back, remember you could have roughly a 1-to-2 premium hand to draw ratio, right? Well, on the turn, that number is going to shrink to a 1-to-1 ratio. So on the flop, you could have 1/3 premium hands, 2/3 draws when you were bluffing with a polarized strategy. But now on the turn, that number is going to be closer to 50-50. The marginal made hands to junk is still going to be about 70-30, so that's not going to change when you go to the turn. On the river, by the way, you're going to have even fewer bluffs, but we'll discuss that when we get to the river later. So you're essentially going to need to find additional hands that you want to check with. And these hands are going to be usually premium hands on the flop, like top pair, top kicker. They get downgraded to marginal hands on the turn, such as when the turn brings an overcard, right? Let's say you have ace-jack on jack 7-3. You bet, they call, turn is a queen. It's a pretty bad turn, right? Where your opponent could reasonably have a queen. They're not going to have a queen a ton, but if you have ace-jack and it comes jack 7-3-2, that's still a very premium hand on the turn, right? But if the turn is a queen or a king, it's a strong marginal made hand or a weak premium hand. It's somewhere in there. If you had a hand like jack 10 or a queen jack and the turn brought an overcard, then that hand is pretty definitively a marginal made hand, right? So very often the premium hands that became marginal are going to be checking. And also your draws that got worse often don't want to bet. Like say you did have backdoor flush draw and backdoor straight draw with an overcard or something like that, and the turn just brings a complete blank to where none of your backdoor draws are possible on the turn. Well, now that hand becomes junk. Also, you're going to have some draws that are so good that you don't want to get bet or you don't want to get raised off of them after you bet. So say you do have something like a good flush draw. That's a hand where if you bet and get jammed on, you would conceivably have to fold it, and that would be really bad. So in that scenario, maybe you want to be checking that hand too. That almost plays kind of like a marginal made hand at that point, but we'll be discussing that as we move forward to the turn to make sure you're not going to bet in scenarios where you get blown off of your equity. We have a few questions in the chat, by the way. I figure I'll go ahead and answer them. Won't observant opponents realize that you are checking the turn when an overcard comes? Well, you have to realize you're going to keep betting with your best hands and your draws, right? Your marginal hands, like in the example, top pair that becomes middle pair, does not keep betting, but you keep betting with your new top pairs and also with your draws. Also, are these ratios GTO or exploitative? These are roughly GTO ratios. You have to realize the purpose of my course here, the Tournament Masterclass, is not to teach you to play the perfect GTO strategy. If you look at basically every other poker course on the market, the cam froze. Yes, I know, I paused it. Here we go. If you look at every other poker course on the market, they show you a ton of GTO simulations and say, here, just do this. The problem, though, is that us humans cannot remember that. So I give you rules and strategies to follow so that you can play roughly the GTO strategy in every scenario. So those ratios I listed previously are for when you bet the flop with a polarized range, which implies you're not betting with your entire range. All right, let's keep moving forward. So let's first discuss continuation betting on the turn. So what is a turn continuation bet? This is when the flop aggressor, meaning you bet the flop, continues betting on the turn. If there was no aggressor on the flop, and then you bet the turn, you're not a turn continuation better, you're just betting because you did not bet on the flop, right? So in order for there to be a turn continuation bet, there must have been a bet on the flop, and that person who bet the flop is the same person betting on the turn. So to be really clear, you raise, let's say button, big blind calls, flop comes, big blind checks, you bet the flop, they call. On the turn, they check, you bet again. That's a turn continuation bet. All right, typically, in this scenario, the equities are going to become closer on the turn because whenever you bet the flop, as you're going to be doing with either a very wide strategy or with a somewhat polarized strategy, and your opponent calls, they have in theory folded out all of their junk or the vast majority of their junk, right? So when they check call your flop bet, their range gets substantially stronger. So let's say you're in a scenario where you continuation bet your entire range on the flop, and your opponent folds out the bottom 20, 30, 40, 50% of their range on the flop. Now the ranges just must be a whole lot closer, right? So in most scenarios on the turn, whenever you are making a turn continuation bet, you're going to want to be using a very polarized strategy where you're betting your best hands and your draws. And you're always going to want to think about how the turn card interacts with both players' ranges to see who has the range advantage and to see who has the nut advantage. We're going to be going through all sorts of examples of this to make it really clear when you have the range advantage and nut advantage and how that impacts your strategy. So you're going to want to consider the type of turn card that comes, because quite often cards that are similar will impact your range in similar ways. An overcard, for example, usually favors the continuation better because they're going to continuation bet with a lot of random overcard hands. So then when an overcard comes on the turn, that's going to be okay for them, right? Also, sometimes draws can complete. Sometimes boards can pair. So the top card, middle card, or bottom card can pair on the turn. And sometimes the turn's going to be a complete blank. So let's discuss, for the flop aggressor, which turn cards are particularly good. And when you do get a card that is particularly good, it increases your equity, your EV, right? And when your equity increases, that typically allows you to bet more frequently. Not always, but usually. So turn cards that are better for the flop aggressor are turns that bring an overcard, and especially an ace, because very often the flop aggressor will be betting with a wide-ish range of more than just the absolute best hands and draws, right? They're betting sometimes with almost everything, as we've seen in the flop examples. And often that includes a whole lot of ace highs. So let's say the board is king 8-4 ace. The ace just nails their range, and that's a scenario where the flop aggressor gets to keep betting the turn very frequently. Even like 8-5-2 king, 8-5-2 queen, that's good enough for the flop aggressor to usually keep betting the turn. Also, you want to keep betting on turns that give you a large nut advantage. That's usually going to be when you have a whole lot of the big cards on the board, like ace, queen, 10, jack, ace, king, 10, jack, right? Really, if a random king or queen or ace makes the super nuts, that's usually going to be favoring the player who bet the flop very, very heavily, because they're going to have a whole lot of those like top pairs with good kickers or middle pairs with good kickers, or just straights already and whatnot. Neutral turns are turns that don't especially change the equity. And now in these scenarios, you're going to be doing a mix of continuation betting the turn and checking. And neutral cards are usually cards that pair the top card on the board, such as 9, 7, 5, 9, or essentially blanks like king, king, 6, 10, or ace, jack, 5, 2. And in this scenario, usually you're going to have between like 40 and 60% equity in most scenarios, which is fine. You're never like a huge favorite or a huge underdog, but sometimes you will just completely lack the nut advantage in various scenarios. And we're going to go through this in some of the examples, but there are going to be times where you may even have a little bit of an equity advantage, but if you lack the nut advantage because your opponent has a lot of, let's say, random trips in their range and you don't, despite the fact that you have a range advantage, you're going to have to do more checking in that scenario again. So the idea of range advantage and nut advantage are still going to apply. As you have more nut hands in your range, you get to generally just bet more frequently. As you have fewer nut hands in your range, you have to do a little bit more checking. And then bad turn cards, these are turn cards that usually give your opponent the advantage, are when the middle or bottom card pair, such as jack 7-3-7 or king 9-5-5. Because if you think about it, let's say you raise middle position, big blind calls, you continuation bet jack 7-3. If you're going to have a checking range on jack 7-3, it's going to be a lot of your 7s and your 3s, right? And your opponent, if they're going to have a check calling range on jack 7-3, is definitely calling with all their 7s and all their 3s. And they may even raise with some of their jacks, right? So when you bet, there are going to be some 7s and 3s that may not be in your range because you would have checked them, but you bet, right? And your opponent, whenever they check call, they have all of their 7s and their 3s, because if they had a better hand or a junkier draw or something like that, they would have put in a raise instead. So their range is going to be very condensed around the weak top pairs, middle pairs, and bottom pairs. And so when the middle card pairs or the bottom card pairs, that should connect very well with them, and it's going to give them the nut advantage, right? So this is a spot where like maybe you don't have such a huge equity disadvantage, but you have a big nut disadvantage. Like in this spot, maybe it's like you have 42% equity or 45% equity as the flop aggressor when you get a pretty bad 7 on the turn, but your nut advantage is, well, you have no nut advantage. Your opponent has the nut advantage. Also, turns that complete a lot of your opponent's logical draws are quite bad. Usually these are going to be the low straight type cards that make 4 straights or sometimes even 3 straights on the turn. And the times when these don't complete your opponent's straights, often they're going to have like random 2 pair, which is pretty good as well. So like 9, 7, 5, 6. These are scenarios where your opponent in the big blind, or especially like out of position in general, are usually going to have a lot of equity and also a lot of nut hands. And that means you, in turn, have to be pretty careful. Okay, so understand that when you have the turn range advantage, it's kind of like a power-up that lets you continue betting with more hands. Kind of like on the flop, right? When you have the range advantage and when you have the nut advantage, you want to be betting very, very frequently. Same thing on the turn. When you have a good turn that gives you lots of equity and the nut advantage, you should be betting very frequently, sometimes with nearly everything. That's going to be with your premium hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk. When you get a neutral turn, now, remember, you do want to be betting a little bit more polarized on the turn than you are on the flop, typically. So when you get a neutral turn, you can be betting with your premium hands and your draws for the most part. If you just go through the range analyzer and select your premium hands and draws, usually you're going to be betting with those and you're checking your marginal made hands and your junk. Again, we're going to go through a lot of examples to show you how to structure your range accordingly. And then when you get a bad turn, like say you do get one of those low 4-card straight turns that's just terrible for you, when your opponent does check, very often you're going to want to be checking with almost everything. And when you are betting, your betting range is going to be incredibly polarized. Like say the board is a 4-card low straight, you're really just betting with like straights and sporadic bluffs that have no showdown value. And you're not betting with stuff like sets and 2 pairs and over pairs and whatnot. Because it's just too likely you're beat, because your opponent could be checking with that easy straight that they could have in their range. Also, just like on the flop, you should be checking more often when you're out of position. So again, that's another similarity on the flop compared to the turn. In general, on the turn, remember, you want to be bluffing a little bit less often. And a way to do that is to essentially check with some of your draws. So recall that the ranges are typically stronger, usually like a little bit better, more condensed on the turn. Not in a weak way, but in a strong way. And essentially, your opponents are more likely to have a hand that's pretty good, that could potentially raise you. So, when you have a draw that's pretty good, you have to protect against being raised off of your equity. For example, you have a flush draw and a gut shot, giving you something like 28% equity against your opponent's best hands. Like, say you have Queen, Jack of spades, and the board is 10 of spades, 9 of spades, 3 of diamonds, right? In that scenario, even if your opponent has a really strong hand, you have 28% equity, maybe even more, depending on how weak their really, really strong hand is. But in the scenario, if you bet and your opponent goes all in, often you're going to need to win more than 28% of the time to justify calling. You may need to win 33% of the time or 35% of the time, depending on the stack depth. So in this scenario, even though you don't really have a ton of showdown value with that king, queen of spades, you don't want to bet it, because if you bet and get raised all in, it is horribly, 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 horribly bad for you. So the solution to allow you to bet with fewer bluffs is to check with your draws that are not good enough to call off if your opponent raises you all in, but have a lot of equity that is worth realizing by letting it go check, check. And realize, when you do let it go check, check, you're not always just losing when you miss. Sometimes on the river, if your opponent checks, then you'll bet with your king high, because that's one of your worst hands you could have at that point. So it's not as if you're just always giving up in these scenarios, but you have to ask, how could this hand go horribly wrong? And a way that any poker hand can go horribly wrong is for you to have a lot of equity and then have to fold a lot of equity. So in this scenario, typically on the turn when you're betting, you're going to be more polarized, usually with your best hands, your premium hands, your super nut draws that can call off against a raise. This may be pairs plus draws or the nut draw that beats all the other draws. And then also draws that are really weak that can bet and then fold to a raise. But your decently strong medium strength draws are the draws that don't really want to bet, because if they bet and get shoved on, they'd have to fold, and you really don't want to fold. Now let's discuss the turn continuation bet frequency and sizing flowchart. This is very similar to the flop flowchart, and you're going to find that your frequency is again determined by if you have a lot of equity and a nut advantage on the turn. So when you get a turn that's particularly good for you, Usually this is going to be the random overcards, right? These are going to be turns that you get to bet very frequently, 75% of the time, or sometimes even more. Usually you're not betting 100% of the time on the turn, but often you will be betting pretty frequently whenever you get a very good turn card. When you get a neutral turn card, you're going to be doing a decent amount of checking, sometimes like 50, 60% of the time. And that makes sense because now we're just betting pretty polarized. You're just betting your best hands and your draws. And then when you get a bad turn card, one that gives your opponent a decent amount of equity, you're going to want to be betting infrequently, usually with just your very, very strong nut hands and your junky draws. We have a few additional bad turns here that we didn't mention earlier. Notice here we have like a 4 diamond board. The 4 diamond boards, or 4 to a flush boards, are particularly bad for the initial raisers if there are a bunch of high diamonds or high cards of the suit on the board. And that's because if you think about, let's say under the gun raises, big blind calls, under the gun actually does not have a whole lot of king of diamonds here. They really only have ace with the king of diamonds and king of diamonds with the queen. They're probably not raising king, jack, king, 10, etc. They could have pocket kings as well, but really that's not all that many combinations of it. Whereas the player in the big blind would play a lot of king of diamonds X pre-flop, and they would check call all the king of diamonds X on the flop, right? So this is a spot where big blind actually has a lot of equity in this scenario. Same thing on this other 3 flush board. Also in this scenario, like king, king, 6, 6, this is a spot where when your opponent check calls, they have a whole lot of kings and a whole lot of 6s on the flop. And you have to then proceed with caution, even though you do have some kings in your range. So anyway, these are bad turns, and on bad turns, you want to be checking very, very frequently, usually betting with just the absolute best hands and some junky draws. In terms of sizing, same thing as on the flop. Do we have the range advantage? If we do, we want to ask, do we have the nut advantage? If we don't, we're going to want to be betting on the smaller side. If we do, we want to ask, how well does the opponent's range connect with the board? If it does not connect especially well, usually when the board's uncoordinated, you're going to want to bet on the smaller side. If your opponent's range connects very well with the board, meaning they're going to have a lot of hands that can reasonably continue, you're going to want to be betting using a larger size. And if you do not have a range advantage, you know you're betting polarized, right? Down here, you're betting infrequently. And if we're betting infrequently, we want to be betting using a large size. So that's how you go about playing on the turn when determining when to continuation bet. We'll take a look at a lot of examples to make this situation even more clear to you. All right. I see a lot of you have various turn questions. If there's a pair on the board, should you automatically assume your opponent could have it? Depends on the scenario, right? Depends on what range they're working with. But yeah, quite often they will have some trips in their range. There were a few other questions here that I liked. Let's see. Does this assume the preflop raiser's continuation betting into a blind defender? A lot of these examples were from that scenario, but we'll discuss out of position as well. Good turn cards, bet more frequently. Bad turn cards, bet less frequently. Yeah, absolutely. Right? And again, like I think what happens to a lot of people is they get stuck on the idea of they need to look at lots of solvers and try to memorize what the solver does. But if you follow this flow chart here, you're going to be playing pretty close to the solver in most scenarios, which is quite powerful, right? Okay, so let's take a quiz. Below every portion of the Tournament Masterclass, we have quizzes. All right, which of the following are typically negative equity turn cards for the flop continuation better? Take a second to think about it. Type it in the chat. We have 3 options here, 1, 2, or 3. It can be more than one. Is it when the turn and middle card, the turn pairs a middle or bottom card, when the turn completes a lot of your opponent's draws, or when the turn brings an overcard to the board? Which of the following is a typically negative equity turn for the flop continuation better? Take a second, think about it. While I'm here, when it says less than 50% bet, are you using various sizes, etc.? It depends on the scenario. Mainly stack depth is what's really important there, but quite often on the turn you are betting pretty small, like 30, 40% pot. Something like that. If you all enjoyed this, by the way, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button below. This is the turn section of the Tournament Masterclass. It's about a 30-hour long course, very, very in-depth. Lots and lots of very actionable, implementable strategies to make sure you are playing well. If some of the turns were unfamiliar to you, like marginal made hand or range advantage, all of that stuff is explained thoroughly in the Tournament Masterclass. All right. I think here the answers are 1 and 2. Why? When the turn pairs a middle or bottom card, remember that connects well with the opponent's check calling range because they're going to check call all their middle and bottom pairs, and you may not bet the middle and bottom pairs, right? And next, when the turn completes your opponent's draws, you check a whole lot more often because they have a lot of nuts, right? When the turn brings an overcard, that is usually good for the flop continuation better because you're going to be betting with a lot of your quote-unquote draws, like random overcards. And that's usually going to be good for you. So I'm pretty sure this is it. I could be wrong, but this time we're right. All right, next question. What happens to your turn betting frequency on bad turns? Does it go up? Does it go down? Or does it stay the same? Take a second. Think about it. Type it in the chat. You all are nailing it. Number 2 here. It definitely goes down. Whenever the turn's bad for you, just always check way more often, right? When you have the nut advantage and are betting a polarized range on the turn, should you bet large or small? When you have the nut advantage and are betting a polarized range, should you bet big or should you bet little? Take a second. Think about it. Did you also know on YouTube there's a notification bell? Click the notification bell. Ding, ding, ding. That'll let you know whenever we have a new video coming out. We have lots of new content coming out. By the way, if you're a poker coaching member, Tommy Angelo is having a webinar in about 37 minutes, so make sure you check that out. This is a spot where you want to be betting large. Right. When you have the nut advantage and bet using a polarized range, you are going to want to use a big sizing. How else are you going to get all in by the river? That's right, Sean. You nailed it. All right. That was one section. Now let's go through a few examples on the turn. Now let's discuss some turn continuation betting examples. This is the first time you may have seen this type of image, so let's take it really slow and go through it line by line. All right, 40 big blinds deep, under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls, flop comes ace, jack, 5, 2 spades. On the flop, big blind checks, under the gun +1 bets 67% pot, big blind calls. Okay, now the turn is going to come some card, and this chart shows the equity of the in position player, the under the gun +1 player who bet the flop. The top row of this chart shows the card that comes on the turn. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, jack, queen, king, or ace, right? The column here shows the suit. So if you wanted to find the 4 of diamonds, it would be 4 of diamonds right here. And this shows how much equity the in-position player's range has against the big blinds range. And in this scenario, if the in-position player has 48%, then the out-of-position player must have 52% because there's 100% total. Okay, so let's go line by line or cell by cell and discuss how each turn impacts the player's equities. It's important to note, though, that when the big blind checks and under the gun +1 bets 2/3 pot, or really any bet in this scenario, and the big blind calls, the big blind will have folded out all of their junk. So if they fold out all of their junk, that means the ranges are actually going to be quite close in strength. Assuming the under the gun +1 player continuation bet with all or most of their range, as they often will on this ace jack 5 board, right? So this is a spot where the ranges are going to be kind of close in general. As you see here, the spread on this image is between, 42% and 57%, 58%, which is actually a pretty tight spread. We're going to see some examples later where the turn will just really, really heavily favor one player. All right, so let's just go through cell by cell. Ace. On an ace of clubs, hearts, or diamonds, you'll see that the equities are basically 50-50. You may say, but doesn't under the gun +1 have a lot of aces in their range? They do, but so does the big blind, because they will not fold any ace to a flop bet, right? So ace is roughly 50-50. Notice you can't have the ace of spades. Well, the turn card can't be the ace of spades because it's already on the flop. Same thing for jack of hearts and 5 of spades, right? That's why these are blank. What about a king, a queen, or a 10? So high cards that do not pair the board. Turns out these are going to be actually very good for the under the gun +1 player because they have ace king and pocket kings in their range. Like say the turn's a king, right? Whereas the big blind does not. Same thing on a 10. They have pocket 10s and they have ace 10, right? Whereas the big blind probably has ace 10, but maybe not even pocket 10s. So anyway, you'll find that these big cards that don't pair the board line up very, very nicely with under the gun +1's range, which means they're going to have a decent chunk of equity. 56% usually is still pretty high. And these equity numbers will translate to your betting frequency, which I'm going to show you in a second. And then as the card is lower, it typically favors the player in the big blind because they're going to have a whole lot of hands like ace 7, right? Or jack 7 or 7-5, whereas under the gun +1 doesn't have many of those hands, right? So as the card gets lower and lower, it's going to favor the under the gun +1 player more than the big blind, especially this 2, 3, and 4 down here. You may think that these would be especially like neutral because they're basically blanks, but you see they're not actually. They actually start to favor the out of position player in the big blind because they have a lot of hands like ace 2, 3, 4, right? And ace 2, ace 3, ace 4, and then also hands like 5, 3, 5, 2, 5, 4, etc. So they have all of these cards that work in here to the point that they're going to have a decent number of hands here. You also notice the spades in this example are particularly bad, right? Spades are bad because they put 3 spades on the board. And in this exact scenario, under the gun +1 doesn't actually have a lot of flushes in their range because in this situation, when the ace of spades is on the board, that blocks a lot of the flushes that under the gun +1 would naturally have in their range to begin with, right? So for that reason, there aren't a ton of flushes available. And the player in the big blind is going to have like all suited spades to some extent. So the flush card is quite good. Also notice the jack and the 5 are pretty bad for the under the gun +1 player as well, because under the gun +1 doesn't have as many jacks as the big blind or 5s. And when those cards pair, that makes the top pair type hands way worse. And that's going to result in those cards being better for the out of position player. Also notice we have this interesting 5 of hearts, which is better than the 5 of diamonds or clubs. That's because on the 5 of hearts, the under the gun +1 player picks up some backdoor flush draws, so their equity is going to be a little bit higher. Okay, so that is every hand in this chart. And if you think about all of this makes pretty logical sense, right? You're going to have more equity on cards that are better for your range. It's your job to figure out how the ranges interact. Now that we know that, we can see that these percentages translate to betting frequency. Remember how I said the king, the queen, and the 10 are particularly good for under the gun +1? As you see, that's when you have a lot of equity. Turns out when you have a lot of equity, you do a lot of betting. Take a look at the jack and the 5. Those are pretty bad cards. You see on the jack and the 5, you do a whole lot of checking, right? Also, the spades are particularly bad. You're going to be doing a whole lot of checking. And now remember I said like the 2, 3, and 4 are worse for the under the gun +1 player than like a 9, 8, or 7, which results in you doing more betting when on the higher cards than you do on the lower cards. And all of this should make intuitive sense. Like as the card is better for you, you should be betting more frequently. But you can see that it does directly translate to you betting more often, right? It's not always going to be a crystal clear ratio. Like, if you're just because you have a good range advantage does not necessarily mean you're always betting. But very often it will indicate betting substantially more often than on the worst cards. So let's go through a few individual turn cards. I'll show you the implementable strategy, and we'll discuss how that lines up with the GTO strategy. Here we raise under the gun +1, big blind calls. By the way, I explained how to go through and make this entire chart. This is the type of thing that we do with our students at pokercoaching.com. So I know you may not know how to do this if you're not a poker coaching member, but being able to go through and figure out how to play your range in a very implementable way is very, 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 very valuable. And I show throughout this course how this lines up roughly with the GTO strategy, and it comes out pretty nicely. Ace, jack, 5, they check, we bet, they call. Turn is a 2 of hearts, they check. And this is a situation where you, again, just want to take your entire range that you make it to the turn with, which in this scenario is actually your entire pre-flop range, because you would have bet that whole range on the flop. If there were some hands in your range you didn't bet on the flop, those hands would no longer be in your range. But this ace, jack, 5 board we bet every time. So in this scenario, you want to go through and just recategorize all of your hands. Whatever hands you make it to, recategorize them logically. So we're going to have most of our reasonable top pairs betting. So you see like ace 8 and better is a premium hand. We can happily bet that. Weaker aces are marginal. Kings and queens are marginal. Jacks are the jacks are marginal. I have king queen listed as a marginal hand here. It could easily be junk in reality. And then I have some draws. This is just all the flush draws at this point. We're betting all those. And then if we put the under pairs as junk, that's going to result in us having actually too much junk. Because remember, we want at most a 1 draw to 1 premium hand ratio, which right now it's 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, right? So we can have more draws, but we're actually kind of hurting in the marginal made to junk category. We have a little bit too much junk, especially if we had an additional 12 combinations of hands here in the junk category, right? So you want to take some of the hands out of your junk and use it as draws when you could have more draws. So I think it's certainly viable to be betting in this scenario with additional hands that may not make logical sense. You're going to find that the hands that often get added to the betting range on the turn that don't make natural logical sense as they draw are usually the smallest pairs in your range, because essentially they have 2 outs if they happen to be behind, and you also really need some bluffs because your range is so good, right? This is a neat spot because in reality, like some of these draws that are actual draws, like King 10 of spades, may not even want to bet if you're going to get check raised. I don't think you're going to get check raised all that often in this scenario against most players you play against, but the GTO opponent will. So I bet if we look at the solver here, it's probably going to tell you to be a little bit cautious with King 10 and Queen 10 because you don't really want to bet those and get raised. Also, the classification of junk, by the way, I want to make this clear that junk doesn't mean it always loses. Whenever you have a junk hand, 10s let's say, the plan is to check behind on the turn and then fold if your opponent bets on the river. But if you check behind on the turn and you get to check behind on the river, you actually win with 10s a decent amount of the time. So junk doesn't mean always loses. Junk just means plans to fold if my opponent bets on the river. Okay? So anyway, these ratios are all nice. We could have a little bit more, a few more draws in our range. Maybe we want to even take some of this junk and continue betting it, like maybe pocket 8s wants to bet. Maybe it's just stuff like more 9-8 offsuits would want to bet, but usually you'll find you don't want to be betting with like total 0 equity hands. And like 9-8 of diamonds is pretty low equity. Anyway, we're betting pretty 50-50 in this scenario, which, if we go back over here to this image, it shows on the 2 of hearts, you bet roughly 50% of the time. So strategy lines up nice. Here's the GTO strategy. Again, I would tell you not to be too overly concerned with the GTO strategy, not even necessarily the ratios here, because as you start checking some portion of your range that is a different portion than the GTO solver does, like the solver is doing a lot of mixing, as it will whenever you're, let's say, out of position continuation betting. In that scenario, you're going to find that these ranges start to not line up quite as well as they did on the flop. However, as you see, you can usually just look for patterns here, like all the good top pairs bet, nut hands all bet. Notice here, like I said, actually, King 10 and Queen 10 don't bet because they don't want to bet and get raised. They have to just check, whereas some weaker hands like 10-8 is betting. Also notice the small pairs are opting to bet some portion of the time for the reasons I outlined. We're just really lacking draws here. So you have to do your best to try to find them. Okay? What about on ace, jack, 5, 10, 2 hearts? Again, go through, categorize your hands. Good top pairs and better, probably going to want to bet. Marginal made hands are going to be hands like top pair, weak kicker, kings, queens, king, jack, right? All that makes logical sense. Find some draws. Again, we really are lacking draws here. If we listed sevens and 6s as junk, we'd have too much junk. Because remember, we want a 70-30 ratio. If we had an additional 12 hands here, we'd have way too much junk, so we have to use those as draws, right? And again, this may be a scenario where you want to be betting even more with these under pairs. I know it doesn't necessarily feel intuitive or logical, but we don't really have any more logical draws. Notice here, like it's even more clear that we don't have any logical draws because King 10 and Queen 10 made a pair. So like, I'm really betting with like every unpaired hand I have for the most part. And if you're betting every unpaired hand you have and you still don't have enough draws, well, maybe you should look for them a little bit harder. So I'm checking 32 or 35%, something like that. Solver checks a little bit less often here. This is a particularly good turn, remember, for the under the gun +1 player. You see, this is one of the best turns actually, which is going to result in under the gun +1 betting pretty frequently. So as you see, just a lot of bets. When you are checking, it's going to be with mostly the very clear marginal made hands, right? And just some stone give up. I guess 9-8 doesn't want to bet and get raised, does it? So I guess that's opting to check sometimes. Notice here again, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s all bet pretty frequently. So perhaps we need to be betting a little bit more in that spot. Also notice top set slow plays a ton. Previous example, slow plays a ton. This example, slow plays a ton. So recognize that this is a situation where you should still be slow playing top set some portion of the time because that really does protect your checking range a lot. And you want to make sure you are protecting your checking range. Notice we have some give ups here like Queen 8 of diamonds or whatnot. That's probably just giving up. King X is just giving up. But yeah, I mean, this all lines up pretty logically. And now, understand that I'm not betting quite as often as the solver, but I think that's okay. As long as we're in the same ballpark, and as long as our premium made to draw ratio is 1 draw at most to 1 premium hand, and our marginal made to junk is 70-30, that's going to result in us being balanced enough to the point that if we are making any sort of like small error, well, if we're making an error, it's going to be small. And you want to make sure that when you're making errors, they are tiny. If you find that you're just like betting 100% of the time when the solver almost never bets, that's probably a problem. If you're betting never and the solver's always betting, that's probably a problem. But if you're in the same region as what the solver is doing, you're probably going to be doing perfectly fine. And really, you should use the solver to just see like which hands are betting frequently and make sure you are betting those. And take a look at which hands are checking frequently and make sure you are also checking those. All right. Did you get all that? A few questions here. What size are we using with our flush draws? Notice here that the flush draws are often betting using the same size as the made hand, right? Turns out you want to be betting with the same size with your premium hands and your draws so your opponents don't know what your hand is when you do bet. The idea of I'm going to bet like small with my flush draws and big with my premium hands is not good against anyone who is reasonable. Why are 7s and 6s draws, quote unquote draws? We went through that in the material here because essentially you don't have enough draws in this spot. And when you don't have enough logical draws, the draws you look to find are the draws that probably don't win a showdown that have 2 outs. Usually the small pairs, like right here. We see on ace, jack, 5, 10, right? We see 9s being used as a quote-unquote draw. You're not betting 9s because it's good. You're betting 9s as a bluff here. Yeah, I mentioned that the king-queen classification is loose. You got to realize, like, the junk classification and the marginal made hand classification gets a little bit muddled. I discussed this in the course, actually, so that is explained. But essentially, you want to ask, like, which hands am I calling river bet with? Which hands am I folding? And you got to realize, like, sometimes king-queen makes a pair and it always calls. Sometimes 10s makes a set and it calls, right? So it's not like you're just always... Like, the draws and the marginal made hands and the junk don't just, like, always lose. All right, so let's take our quiz. Also, by the way, this is just one example. I go through, this is when a good card comes for you, right? We go through all the other boards. We go through out of position, in position. I'm telling you, it's a very, very in-depth course to make sure that you know how to play well. All right, when the flush card comes in, is that good, neutral, or bad for the in-position flop continuation better's equity when against the big blind? Kind of depends on the board, doesn't it? What do you think? Good, bad, or neutral? Certainly there are going to be some boards where it is better than others. Some boards where it's worse than others, right? But in general, don't be too nitpicky on me, everyone. Seems like you are all going with bad in the chat. I agree. Bad. Why? Because the big blind has more flushes than the in-position player. Why do they have more flushes than the in-position player? Because when you min-raise pre-flop and big blind calls, big blind is going to call with lots of suited hands. Almost all of the suited hands. You can check out the GTO pre-flop charts at pokercoaching.com. You can get them on your app, on the Poker Coaching app, and you'll see the big blind calls a ton in that scenario, and that results in them having lots of flushes. Okay, next question. When you're under the gun +1 versus the big blind, and the turn is the 10 of diamonds, or ace, jack, 5, 10, should you continuation bet the turn at a high frequency? Under the gun +1 versus big blind, ace, jack, 5, 10, are we betting pretty frequently or pretty infrequently? I guess the answer is yes or no. Should we bet it at a high frequency? Yes or no? You all enjoy this type of stream, by the way. If you enjoy this show, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button below. That lets me know that you like this. And if you don't like this, well, go do something else with your life. Enjoy your experience. Answer here is definitely yes. We pretty much just went through that example. When you're under the gun +1 versus the big blind, and the turn on is ace, jack, 5, 2. Should you use a large bet size or small bet size? Ooh, tricky one. Ace, jack, 5, 2. Should you use a large bet size or a small bet size? Kind of a nasty one here. Not 100% sure I know the answer. Isn't it true that while they have more flushes, under the gun has the better ones? Yeah, but it doesn't really matter whenever you're playing 40 big blinds deep because any flush is good. I don't actually remember what the answer was to this one. You all are saying small, but I think the answer is large. I'm going to go with the chat and click small, but I think the answer is large. Oh, chat, you got it wrong. You want to be betting big. This is a blank, and in this scenario, you typically want to be betting with a polarized range. Remember, betting kind of infrequently on this bad turn using a large size. When you're betting infrequently, you usually want to bet with a large size. So chat, you got it wrong. Except for Louis Philippe. By the way, Louis Philippe here, very, very diligent studier at pokercoaching.com. He actually runs the poker coaching study groups. Those take place Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the Discord channel. Get in there, study up, and get good at the game. The players in the study group are crushing it. Big but infrequently is what you're supposed to be doing in this scenario. All right, when you're under the gun +1 versus the big blind, and the turn is the ace, jack, 5-2, what should you do if you bet the flop with ace 6, enter check 2 on the turn? Bet big, bet small, or check? What do you think? What do you think? Ace, jack, 5-2. What do we do with ace 6? Waiting for the chat to catch up here. Link to the Discord. Go to pokercoaching.com, get in the community tab, and there'll be a link right there. Check, check. Easy check, everybody. Easy check. Why are we checking? We have a marginal made hand. In this scenario, when you have a very clear marginal made hand on a turn that is not great for you, remember, we just said you're only betting the turn with your best made hands and your draws from the previous question. This is a spot where, on the turn, when we're only betting our best made hands and our draws, we want, well, is a 6 one of our best made hands on ace, jack, 5-2? And the answer is definitely not. This is also a great hand to check, because when it goes check, check on the turn and your opponent bets on any river, you have an easy call. Think about what happens if you bet the turn in this scenario with all of your aces. If you bet the turn with all of your aces, what does that do to your checking range when it goes check, check? That means you have what? Pocket kings and worse? What do you do if your opponent bets the river when you have only kings and worse? Well, you just lose. That's terrible. So you want to make sure in this scenario that you're protecting your checking range by checking some of your top pair bad kickers. If you play in a really straightforward manner where you bet with all of your good hands and check all of your bad hands, you're going to be really, really easy to play against, and you are going to get absolutely demolished at poker. So don't do that. So if you all enjoyed this, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button below. This is part of my tournament masterclass, and, since all of you are here today, I'm going to give it to you for free for a few days. Limited time access, Poker Coaching Premium, including everything on the site. Every single thing available at Poker Coaching Premium is going to be free. Cost you $0 from February 26th to February 28th. You can go through the whole tournament masterclass if you want. It's long. It's about 30 hours long, plus another 20 hours of hand history reviews where I go through a lot of my recent wins. But it's all free from February 26th to the 28th. So, ready, set, binge. Have fun. Check that out at pokercoaching.com/free pass. At pokercoaching.com, we have over 1,100 quizzes. We are consistently adding more and more and more. Go through, take all the quizzes, binge them, do whatever you want. I'm happy to give it to you. You can go through and really, you get quizzed on scenarios like this, right? I'm not sure what happened here, but let's say we raise pre-flop, big blind calls, flop comes queen, 10-9. What do we do? In this scenario, you have to click what you would do, and then you get real-time feedback in the video format about how the quiz maker would have played that scenario. It's over 1,000 of these, and every question has 3, 4, 5 questions, so call it 3, 4, 5,000 questions available for you. Also, we have the Tournament Masterclass, right? I recently released this 30-plus hour-long Tournament Masterclass, having content like we just went through here. That was part of it. Here I teach you how to play every stage of the poker tournament optimally and how to maximize your equity. I know there's a bunch of other poker courses out on the market, and if you watch them like I have, I watched every single one of them. What they do is they show you a solver image and say, do this. That is not what we do at pokercoaching.com. I show you the solver. I make sure we're playing pretty close to the solver, but I teach you strategies that you can actually implement at the table so that you can figure it out, as opposed to having to memorize a bazillion charts. Here is the table of contents for the Tournament Masterclass. It is a big course. It's going to take a decent amount of studying. Not going to lie, you're probably not going to get through it in 3 days. Some of you can accept the challenge if you'd like. But as you see, pre-flop, we go through and explain how your strategy changes at various stack depths, because it does change. We also have the GTO pre-flop charts at pokercoaching.com. Make sure you use those. We go through playing the flop, the turn, the river. The river is especially educational because I realize the river is a spot where a lot of people screw up. And, we had that flow chart where I explained how to figure out how often to bet and then what size. We do that on the river because the river is actually a pretty weird scenario, and you have to figure out which hands to bet and which hands to check, and how to make sure you're protecting your checking range with some nut hands, right? Also, we go through ICM, tournament format adjustments like satellites, etc. We discuss finances, bankroll management, other topics, and then a bunch of hand history reviews. These are some of my wins over the last few months. Winning a $600 tournament, third place in a 1K, second place in a 1K PKO, a bunch of satellite wins in random $50 tournaments. So all buy-in sizes recently. I also just won a $500 tournament the other day, and I am going through that as well. That's available in the classes. Also, as part of the All Access Pass, you'll have access to my Cash Game Masterclass. If you're a cash game player, you will not be left out. We have a 29-part cash game class where I teach you how to crush cash games up to 5-10, no limit. We also have over 300 classes and webinars. These are usually 30 minutes to 2 hours long. So we'll call this, 400 or 500 hours worth of content. You think you can get through that in 2 days? Good luck. Featuring content from all of our pros. We have GTO content from the GTO master, Michael Acevedo. He wrote the book, Modern Poker Theory, which is selling like hotcakes, by the way. I'm shocked at how well that book is selling. I would be surprised if it's not like the best-selling poker book on the market, which is pretty cool. I'm glad that we got to make that book happen. We have Jonathan Jaffe. Do you know Jonathan Jaffe? He is the opposite of a GTO player. He is maximally exploitive player. Here we have a video by him check raising flops as the pre-flop raiser. If you ever played with Jonathan Jaffe, he's going to check raise you out of your seat. We have content by Matt Affleck. He is in there coaching every single week with webinars where the topic is voted on by the students. You get to pick what he teaches you. So make sure you do that. We also have Brad Wilson, very, very strong cash game player, making cash game content on a regular basis for pokercoaching.com. And look, it's not cheap to get all this material. So far, I spent over $250,000 of my money to hire these coaches to produce content for you. To be fair, I watch the content too. I'm trying to learn. I work hard at the game too. And I continuously spend money every month, mid 5 figures, to get you good, high-quality content from some of the absolute best coaches in the world. And you can access it for free for $0 February 26th to 28th. So make sure you check that out. Here's our roster of coaches. I'll just go through a few of them briefly. We have Faraz Jaka. He was WPT Player of the Year, like I was. If you're WPT Player of the Year, they give you that giant spiky trophy over there. That's pretty fun. James Romero. He was one of the top 10 poker players pre-COVID live in tournaments. Absolute crusher. I love his content. Bert Stevens, DraftGanger. He regularly streams for the members privately. He's currently the number 5 tournament player in the world online. Seems like he final tables a major tournament every week. When he streams, I didn't realize he did this, but he guarantees a final table. He's going to stream until he makes a final table. In his last stream, he won an $800 tournament. He's an absolute crusher. We already mentioned Brad Wilson. We have Alex Fitzgerald. He's probably coached more poker players than anyone, and he will teach you how to succeed. Tommy Angelo. Tommy Angelo is the mindset guru. I've learned so much from him before he even knew me. I studied all of his work as a young poker player, and I'm happy to have him on as a coach. He actually has a webinar happening. If you're a poker coaching member, that's happening in 9 minutes. Go to pokercoaching.com, get into the dashboard, click the link, and get into that webinar with Tommy Angelo. We also have Evan Jarvis, Gripst. We have Lexy Gavin, strong tournament and cash game player. She has lots of great content. We talked about Michael Acevedo. Tristan Wade, also someone who has helped a lot of players succeed at the game. And I know just recently he was going through one of his students' very, very deep run. So make sure you check that out. And like I said, Matt Affleck, he is a workhorse. He produces tons of content for PokerCoaching.com, and the students love him. I think he may be the coach that the students resonate the most with, because he's in there grinding it out, working hard, presenting the students content on whatever they ask for on a very regular basis. Our students are crushing it too. Probably our most successful student is Blah Zerjow, absolute crusher. He has $2.4 million in tournament earnings. He went from playing small stakes $5 tournaments to winning many millions of dollars in tournaments. I'm very, very proud of him. And after he won, he wasn't just like, oh my God, I'm rich, I'm going to go be a degenerate. No. He finished school, got his degree, set a bunch of money aside, bought his mom a house, and he's basically set for life with some money to spare to be a poker player. And he's still crushing it. So good job, good work for him. So that's that. It's your turn. Check it out, PokerCoaching.com/free pass. Go there right now to make sure you get on the list so that you have access to Poker Coaching Premium. It costs you a whopping $0. No credit card required. None of that. I don't know what more you want from me. If you do sign up, you get 100% money back guarantee. If you don't like it, tell me and I'll give you a full refund. Gnarleton says, the coaches are so down to earth and never make you feel dumb for asking donkey questions. The premium membership is worth it. Well, that's what we're going for, right? A lot of the poker content out there by some players who are absolute world-class players is so high level and so, difficult to understand unless you're already a poker genius that it's just not applicable, right? And I realize that most of you out there are not the best poker players in the world. I'm not the best poker player in the world, right? And I want to make sure that you are learning how to play well in a way that is actually understandable and digestible and implementable. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to show you a lot of charts and say, do what the chart says. You have to make sure you have strong systems in place. Going back to bragging about Matt Affleck, I've learned a few systems from him about like which hands to 4-bet bluff with, right? He has these systems in place where he knows how to do these things. And he shares it with his students, right? We also have the study group. Louis Philippe has the study group. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they go through the poker coaching content. What else do we have? We have the GTO pre-flop charts. We have the app. I'll show you the app real quick on my phone. Can I show it to you real quick? Give me just a second. I'll load it up. You can go through and you can essentially find whatever spot you want. So we have tournaments and cash games, all sorts of stack depths. Let's say I'm pulling it up on my phone. Let's say we are on the button, 60 big blinds deep versus a 3-bet from the small blind. There you go. We have a GTO chart pulled up. It took about half a second, and it will show you how to play your entire range in that scenario. That's just included. There's some sites out there that charge $300 per month for fewer charts. That's just included. I don't know why you would pay another site $300 per month for access to the content when we give it to you, free for these few days. So make sure you do that. Matt Affleck hops in the study groups as well. Good. Glad to hear it. So yeah, check it out. Jeremy asks, as you move up in stakes, is the game easier to beat because the players play better? No. As your opponents play better, they make fewer mistakes. Okay? Whenever they make fewer mistakes, that means your edge is going to go down. While it is nice to learn how to play fundamentally sound poker, a lot of your edge is going to come from taking advantage of whatever your opponents do incorrectly. There's a lot in the Tournament Masterclass and the Cash Game Masterclass and Poker Coaching Premium in these 300 plus classes we have discussing how to maximally exploitate your opponents. And if you are thinking that you just need to follow a chart and just do that, you're going to be leaving money on the table. So if you're playing the 1 cent, 2 cent games or whatever it is, and let's say your opponents go all in blind every hand, right? Because they're crazy. Fine. Call off with a much wider range. If you get like ace-9 offsuit and you know they're all in with 100% of hands, ace-9 offsuit's the nuts. You should be thrilled to call. Yeah, you're going to have variance, but you're going to print money. How do we get in the study group? Get in our Discord. Go to pokercoaching.com. Click on the community tab. Let's see if I can find this. Can I bring this up? It doesn't look like it's going to work. Go to pokercoaching.com, go to the community tab, and it's just right there. You'll get in there. You win when your opponents make mistakes. Yeah, that's pretty much it. When your opponents screw up, you win all the money. When your opponents don't make mistakes, it's probably time to find a better game. A lot of people think that just because a game exists, that they have to play it. There's a lot of live casinos that rake a ton, and the game is unbeatable, right? When the game is unbeatable because of a high rake, you don't have to sit there and just lose your money. You don't have to play. Number one rule of poker is to find a game you can beat. I mean, look, let's get real here, right? All you really have to do to win at poker, there's only 3 things. Find a game you can beat, play it a lot, and keep a proper bankroll. That's all you got to do. Now, to be fair, most people do not want to do the work to find a game they can beat. You can find a game you can beat in a few ways. You can just find really bad players to play with. This is what happens in like high stakes private home games where they find just horrible, horrible poker players. Or if you don't have the network with a bunch of super rich fish, you're going to have to study the game. You're going to have to get good, right? You're going to have to work harder than your opponents. Hate to break it to you. If you want to succeed at poker, you're going to have to study. So find a game you can beat. Play it a lot. Someone mentioned earlier, I've been on a 3-month downswing or something like that. But again, what is 3 months? If 3 months is 12 tournaments, well, get used to it. But if 3 months is a lot of time, then, maybe you're playing a game you can't beat. But if you find a game you can beat and you play it a lot and you keep a good bankroll, you're going to win. You're going to print money. That is the system that I have used to crush the games. And I'm trying to think, like literally every other poker player I know who is not just, it's going to sound bad, a lucky degenerate. Every poker player I know who has succeeded long-term, grinded it up. Sure, you may have big scores here and there, but you got to realize I started with $50. $50. Grinded it up slowly. Never had a big score. I turned $50 into about $350,000, and my biggest score ever was $1,000. $1,000, which was a whopping 5 buy-ins in my game. We did that by making sure we played an edge with a good bankroll. How do we pick my site over all the others? Well, you got to realize, we already discussed this, right? We do our best to make sure you actually learn how to play well and implement your strategies. I'm not going to just sit down and play a bunch of poker hands and tell you to figure it out. And I'm not going to show you a million GTO charts and say copy them. That's not how we operate. Also, we give you access for free. Get in here and try it. What more do you want from me? Cost you literally $0. Where's the $500 giveaway? Go to pokercoaching.com/TMC giveaway. We're giving away $500 in cash plus 6 months of poker coaching premium. So make sure you get access to that. And make sure you sign up at pokercoaching.com/freepass for the all access pass to poker coaching premium taking place between February 26th and 28th. Tommy Angelo has a webinar starting now, so I'm going to go get in that. If you're a poker coaching member, there's a link right there in the dashboard. Craig says, joining poker coaching is the most plus EV thing you can do for your poker career. Educational poker content is cheap compared to how much you can win if you make good use from it. I've spent loads of money on private coaching, and it's been well worth it. So, check out Poker Coaching Premium now. It costs you $0. Literally $0. Have a good day. Thank you all for being here. Again, if you like this show, do me a favor and click the like button, click the subscribe button.